A quiet street. A figure in the shadows. A woman's last steps caught on camera. Her name was Janet Lambert. She never made it home that night. Her neighbor's security camera captured the horror in chilling detail. But what happened next shocked everyone. Janet Lambert was 34. A nurse, beloved in her community in Portsmouth, Virginia. Her smile was the kind that lit up hospital halls. Patients adored her. And her neighbors described her as the safest soul on the block. The man who would take everything from her? Jacob Newton. A quiet face in the crowd. He lived just 2 doors down. This case shattered the illusion of safety in a suburban neighborhood. And it was all caught on tape. We post daily. Subscribe so you never miss a case. Janet Lambert's life looked ordinary from the outside, but to the people who knew her, it was quietly extraordinary. At 34, she had built a reputation as the kind of nurse who never gave up on her patients. Colleagues at Portsmouth General described her as the one who stayed late when no one else would, the nurse who held a trembling hand or whispered encouragement when machines beeped in the dark. After a 12-hour shift, she'd return to her small white house on a calm tree-lined street. To neighbors, Janet was the heart of the block. She had her routines. Every morning before sunrise, coffee in hand, she would water the roses that grew by her porch. The flowers were her pride, bright reds and soft pinks blooming against the white paint of her house. In the evenings, after finishing her shift, she liked to take long walks around the neighborhood, waving at joggers and chatting with dog walkers. To anyone watching, she looked untouchable, a woman who had built her own safe little corner in the world. But safety is often an illusion. And illusions, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. Neighbors recalled subtle signs of tension. A door slammed late at night. Raised voices drifting across driveways. At first they dismissed it. After all, every neighborhood has its frictions. But in hindsight, those moments feel like the early cracks before a collapse. Janet herself had confided in a coworker weeks before her death. She mentioned that sometimes, when she came home after work, she had the uneasy sense that someone was watching her from the shadows. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as paranoia. Yet the coworker noticed the way her voice trembled, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Jacob Newton lived only 2 houses away. To most, he was a ghost. He didn't join block parties, didn't wave to passing cars, didn't even mow his lawn on time. At 38, he had already built a reputation for being temperamental. His past included shouting matches with delivery drivers, disputes over property lines, and bursts of anger in grocery stores. People whispered, but no one confronted him directly. He was, as one neighbor later said, the kind of man you avoided eye contact with. And yet, his presence barely registered in Janet's life until it was too late. In the days leading up to her death, Janet's routines remained steady. She visited her mother in Chesapeake, laughed with her sister over the phone, and bought groceries at the corner store where the cashier adored her cheerfulness. Everything seemed normal. Yet under the surface, something sinister was gathering momentum. The night before the murder, Janet returned home just after sunset. A neighbor remembered seeing her pause by her roses, bending to touch the petals as if grounding herself. She stayed there a while, standing in the glow of her porch light, as if reluctant to step inside. That was the last time anyone saw her alive in the light of day. Because by the following night, Janet Lambert would no longer be safe in her home. Jacob Newton was already watching. Already planning. Already waiting. It was a quiet Tuesday night in Portsmouth. The kind of night when porch lights glow against the still air and the only sounds are crickets and the distant hum of cars on the highway. Janet Lambert had just finished her shift at the hospital. She stopped by the grocery store, grabbed a few essentials, and drove home around 9:15 p.m. Her car pulled into the driveway like it had 100 times before. The neighborhood cameras caught it all. Janet stepped out, arms full of bags, her keys dangling from her fingers. She paused at the trunk, shifted her groceries, and walked toward her front door. What happened next unfolded in seconds. From the side of her house, a figure emerged, dark clothing, head low. The cameras picked up a blur of movement. Janet gasped, the bags tumbling from her hands, apples rolling across the pavement. There was a muffled struggle. Her voice rose for only a second, a sharp cry cut short by a heavy hand. The figure dragged her off the porch. The camera's angle caught just enough Janet's arms thrashing, the shadow pinning her down, and then silence. The recording ended with a sickening image. Janet pulled into the darkness, leaving behind only scattered groceries glowing under the porch light. Across the street, one neighbor thought she heard something. A noise like bags hitting the ground, followed by quiet. She glanced out the window, saw nothing unusual, and returned to bed. Nobody realized at that moment that a life had just been stolen. By morning, alarm bells were ringing. Janet was due at the hospital at 7 a.m. When she didn't show, her supervisor grew concerned. Calls went unanswered. Texts left unread. By noon, her co-workers contacted police for a welfare check. Officers arrived at Janet's home. The sight chilled them. Her car parked neatly in the driveway, groceries still scattered on the ground. Milk spoiled in the heat. Bread crushed against the pavement. It looked as though she had vanished mid-step. Detectives immediately canvassed the area. One officer knocked on Jacob Newton's door. He appeared calm, even helpful, claiming he had been home all night watching television. Nothing unusual, he said. Nothing suspicious. But the unease in the air was undeniable. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks. How could someone disappear so silently in a safe, suburban street? That evening, detectives reviewed surveillance footage from the block. And there it was, grainy, blurred, but unmistakable. Janet's final moments captured in chilling detail. The figure, the struggle, the silence. It was the breakthrough they needed. A crime had unfolded right under everyone's noses, and now it was undeniable. Janet Lambert had been attacked, and her killer was still living among them. The footage didn't reveal everything. The figure's face was hidden, the shadows concealing critical details. But investigators already had their first real lead. And as detectives tightened their focus, suspicion began circling around one man, Jacob Newton. The footage of Janet Lambert's final moments sent shockwaves through Portsmouth. Detectives now had proof of an attack, but the identity of the shadowy figure remained unclear. The neighborhood, once quiet and close-knit, was suddenly a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across sidewalks. Officers went door to door. Residents peered out from behind curtains, whispering about the killer who might still be living next door. At first, investigators cast a wide net. They interviewed co-workers, family members, and friends. Had Janet been seeing someone new? Did she have enemies? A patient who might have held a grudge? Every possibility had to be considered. Her colleagues insisted she was well-loved, a nurse who went above and beyond. Her family, devastated, echoed the same. Janet had no enemies. She wasn't the kind of person who made them. But detectives knew better. Violence rarely comes from strangers. It usually comes from someone close, someone hiding in plain sight. They began piecing together a timeline. Janet left the grocery store at 9:05 p.m. She pulled into her driveway 10 minutes later. By 9:16 she was gone. The window was razor thin, and that meant whoever killed her was prepared. This wasn't random. It was planned. That's when Jacob Newton's name surfaced again. He had lived on the street for years, mostly unnoticed. But neighbors whispered about his temper. One recalled seeing him shouting at Janet over a parking space months earlier. Another mentioned that he once muttered about people always looking down on him. Still, none of it was enough to connect him to murder. Detectives brought him in for questioning. Newton sat across from them in a small, fluorescent-lit room, arms folded, jaw tight. He claimed he was home that night watching a late baseball game. Alone. No witnesses. His alibi was thin but not impossible. He denied knowing anything about Janet's disappearance. For a moment, investigators wondered, could it be someone else? Maybe a stalker from the hospital? Maybe a stranger passing through? They chased down tips, from sightings of suspicious vans to rumors of prowlers. Each lead ended in frustration. But then, another piece of footage surfaced. A neighbor 2 doors down had a doorbell camera facing the street. At 2:13 a.m., long after Janet vanished, it recorded Jacob Newton leaving his house. He carried something bulky wrapped in what looked like a bedsheet. His limp, subtle but distinctive, matched the stride of the shadowy figure from Janet's final moments. Detectives immediately sought a search warrant. Inside Newton's house, they found freshly cleaned tiles in the kitchen. But forensics don't lie. Traces of blood remained in the grout. DNA confirmed it was Janet's. Hidden in a trash bin outside, officers discovered a set of torn gloves, faint smears of blood on the fingertips. The net was closing. Newton was arrested on suspicion of murder. The calm facade he had worn cracked as he was handcuffed on his porch. Neighbors watched in disbelief. Some filmed on their phones. The man they had passed countless times on their way to work was now the prime suspect in a brutal killing. The case that had begun with grainy footage was now building into something undeniable. But investigators weren't finished yet. They needed one more piece of evidence to seal his fate. When Jacob Newton was brought into custody, detectives knew the case wasn't over. They had circumstantial evidence, blood traces, and that haunting doorbell footage. But to secure a conviction, they needed the final, irrefutable link: Janet Lambert herself. 4 days, search teams combed wooded areas, riverbanks, and abandoned lots around Portsmouth. Volunteers joined officers, holding flashlights in the night, calling Janet's name even though they knew she could no longer answer. Her family waited in agony, clinging to hope but bracing for the truth. Then, 5 days after her disappearance, a breakthrough. A police K9 unit picked up a scent in a dense patch of woods less than a mile from Newton's home. Beneath branches hastily scattered for cover, they found a shallow grave. Inside was Janet Lambert. Her body was wrapped in the same patterned bedsheet neighbors had seen Newton carrying on camera. The discovery devastated the community but gave detectives the final piece of evidence. DNA, fibers, and the sheet itself all tied back to Newton's home. There was no doubt now. The case moved quickly to trial. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, every seat filled with neighbors, hospital staff, and reporters. Janet's mother sat in the front row, clutching a photo of her daughter smiling in her nurse's uniform. Prosecutors presented the chilling CCTV footage frame by frame. The jury watched Janet's final struggle on the porch, saw the shadowy figure drag her into darkness. Then came the doorbell footage: the bulk in Newton's arms, the limp in his walk, the unmistakable outline of guilt. Forensics followed: blood in the tiles, fibers from the sheet, DNA on the gloves. Newton's defense tried to argue reasonable doubt. They claimed the footage was unclear, the evidence circumstantial. But when confronted with his own inconsistencies during cross-examination, when he admitted he had panicked after an argument with Janet, the courtroom fell silent. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge read the sentence, life in prison without parole, Newton stared straight ahead, unblinking, emotionless. No apology. No remorse. Just silence. For Janet's family, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice was served, but their daughter was gone forever. "She was the light of our lives," her mother said outside the courthouse. "And now we'll carry her light for her." The neighborhood where the murder took place still bears scars. Some residents moved away, unable to walk past Janet's porch without reliving the horror. Others keep candles by their windows each year on the anniversary of her death. They say it's their way of reminding themselves and the world that Janet Lambert is not just another name in a headline. The case left Portsmouth shaken. A reminder that evil can lurk even behind the most ordinary doors. And that sometimes, the people you pass on the street, the ones you barely notice, are capable of the unthinkable. But the cameras never lied. They captured everything. And in the end, those silent, watchful lenses helped deliver justice. To understand why Jacob Newton murdered Janet Lambert, investigators turned to criminal psychologists. What emerged was the portrait of a man whose inner world was far darker than his quiet exterior suggested. Jacob Newton exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic rage and paranoid delusions. He had a history of explosive anger over minor disagreements, whether it was a parking space, a noisy neighbor, or a perceived insult. Psychologists explain that in personalities like his, small frustrations can fester until they explode into violence. What made this case especially chilling was Newton's ability to mask his instability. Neighbors described him as withdrawn but not dangerous. He lived in silence, his resentment building quietly. Forensic psychologists often refer to this as the pressure cooker effect. Resentments are bottled up, with no healthy outlet, until one perceived slight becomes the breaking point. Experts also noted signs of delusional misinterpretation, a psychological distortion where an offender convinces himself that others are out to get him. Newton may have believed Janet was against him, or that she disrespected him in some way. In reality, Janet had no conflict with him beyond everyday neighborly interactions. But to someone with Newton's mindset, ordinary gestures, avoiding eye contact, refusing small talk, could be twisted into evidence of hostility. This distorted thinking fueled his violent need for control. Psychologists often call it a power fantasy. The act of ambushing Janet, overpowering her in the shadows, wasn't about revenge for any real wrongdoing. It was about domination, proving, in his fractured mind, that he had the upper hand in a world where he often felt powerless. The choice to hide her body in a wooded area also reveals a familiar criminal pattern, the illusion of control extending beyond the crime itself. By concealing her, he may have believed he could erase his actions, outsmart investigators, and maintain power over the narrative. But like many offenders driven by delusional confidence, he underestimated forensic science and the persistence of detectives. In the end, Jacob Newton's psychological profile fit the mold of what experts call a coercive paranoid killer. An individual with fragile self-esteem, easily triggered by perceived disrespect, who lashes out violently to reassert dominance. These offenders rarely admit guilt, because in their minds the crime was somehow justified. Newton's lack of remorse in court, his flat expression, his refusal to apologize was the final chilling confirmation of his state of mind. Janet Lambert's murder wasn't about jealousy, money, or passion. It was about rage, control, and a broken psyche that turned an ordinary man into a predator. Janet Lambert's story is one of tragedy and betrayal in the place she should have felt safest, her own home, her own neighborhood. A nurse who healed others, a daughter who loved deeply, and a neighbor who brought warmth to everyone around her. Taken by the man who lived just 2 doors away. Her final moments were caught on camera, but her life was so much more than the crime that ended it. She was laughter, kindness, and compassion. And that's how she deserves to be remembered. Jacob Newton's conviction brought justice, but it didn't erase the fear he left behind. Portsmouth is still haunted by the thought that danger can live right next to us, unnoticed until it's too late. For viewers, Janet's case is a stark reminder. We never truly know the people living in the shadows of our own streets. If this story chilled you, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe and watch our next case. Do you think the neighbors ignored too many warning signs? Or was Jacob Newton's darkness simply impossible to see until it was too late?